Today I'm joined by Joseph Cohen, CEO of Universe. Welcome, Joseph.
It's good to be here.
All right. So very interesting. I sense that you are the kind of person that you tend to pave your own path, so to speak. For instance, you dropped out of UPenn School for Wharton School, I think in undergrad, right? To start Lore, which was eventually sold to Noodle. And even before that, you started a number of small businesses as a kid. So tell us about kind of that journey and what kind of propels you.
Yeah, totally. So I've been interested in business my whole life. Business has always been a sort of playground for me and a medium of sorts. So when I was really young, I got interested in computers at around age 10 or so. And I realized that with a computer, you can sort of build things and do things that you couldn't do as a kid. You could publish to the internet. You could make stuff that looked professional. So I used those tools to start different businesses. One of my businesses was the iPod had come out, and my mom's friends all wanted iPods, but they didn't know how to put music on their iPods. So I started a company that helped older people get digital music onto their iPods. And then I started a DJ company a little bit later. But the common thread with all of them was that entrepreneurial, they use computers, and they were creative in some way. So that sort of combination of business, the arts and design, and technology has been my passion for my whole life. And I think for me, the reason I sort of got interested in it was because first I was exposed to computing and the internet, which just inspired me. But secondly, a lot of the people around me growing up were entrepreneurs. So my mom is an entrepreneur, my dad is an entrepreneur, my grandfather is an entrepreneur. They all run small, medium-sized businesses. And I was super inspired by that because I was lucky to sort of understand through that experience that it was possible and that you could sort of affect the world through this channel, and that you could actually create a lot of change, that you could sort of infuse your values into a product or a service and have it go out into the world and do it in a sustainable way that could be endless and it sort of could come to really embody things that you want as an individual in your life. And so I've always been I've been in conversation with business as a medium since I've been 10 years old, and I've always been super enthusiastic about it. And just starting companies to me is the most powerful way to bring an idea into the world. And so if you can synthesize the different disciplines that come together, the different people that are needed, the different ideas, and package them up in a way that makes sense, just massive leverage that opens up. And that process is just super, super fun.
Yeah, I love that philosophy of the notion that entrepreneurship can be reframed as a vehicle by which you influence and bring something novel that transforms humankind. And I love the fact that a lot of that entrepreneurship had rubbed off on you as well. So the part that I want to kind of explore just a little bit before we get into your startup is this notion where you're clearly self-motivated. You self-taught yourself around design, UX, and you decided to drop out of formal education. What do you think in your mind is the role of formal education versus intrinsically motivated passions that people pursue?
Thought a lot about this. Hang on, I'm going to lower this window so we can get better sound. I went to Wharton undergrad, which was incredible because it was the first time in my life that I was exposed to ambitious people and a diversity of sort of intellectual disciplines. So I could, even though it was a business school, it was part of a larger university, and I can drop in on, a class on architecture or on pricing. And you have some of the smartest people in the world talk about that thing. That was incredible. At the same time, I left after 2 years. I left because I was restless. I wanted to get going. I wanted to start my own company. I didn't feel like I was learning that part at school. I also realized that I'm a sort of unique kind of learner. I love learning. It's something I value. Probably top 3 things in my life is just continuous learning. But I do it in a bit of an unorthodox way, and that doesn't really fit with the classic model of, a midterm and finals and a class that's going through this thing, and you got to learn what the textbook says. So I've always had a love-hate relationship with school because on the one hand, it's an institution dedicated to learning and growth, but I actually think the modality of school is obsolete. I think that in the post-internet world, school should look a lot different than it does. And that right now, what we think of as institutional learning is a relic of the industrial era, where you take a sort of a batch of raw material and you process it with certain steps, and out the other side comes like a finished sort of identical homogeneous product. That's really what the school system is designed for. And it's not a coincidence that it came to be, really late 1800s, early 1900s, as the Industrial Revolution was coming into full swing. It's not a coincidence that these institutions came and this model of education sort of permeated the West at that time. With that said, one thing I have learned that is underrated, and you alluded to, is how much sort of motivation and intrinsic motivation is a factor. I think that everybody has different intrinsic motivations. So I don't think that intrinsic motivation exists in some people and doesn't exist in other people. I think, if you're a living, breathing human, there's certain things that motivate you and other things that don't motivate you. And I think that when we talk about intrinsic motivation, these are folks, and I'm lucky enough to, I think, fit into this category, that can, our natural disposition is to sort of go into the world and find the things that motivate us and engage with those things every day, willfully. And that's a matter of, the opportunities I've been exposed to, the people I've met, and ideas I've had, and just circumstance in certain ways. Also, just knowing that about myself, because, for example, if I'm in an environment where I can't go seek out those things, I get very demotivated and depressed, actually. So it's sort of like not an option to not have that. With that said, I believe everyone, even folks who don't have that kind of initiative around finding their motivation, there is something that works for that gets them into their ideal state, their flow state, whatever it is. And so I think it's a failing of our institutions that we don't figure out what makes people sort of sing in that way. So if I were to redesign school, that's how I would approach it. I would think about it, okay, like everyone is unique. Everyone has a certain set of skills, certain weaknesses, certain proclivities. They think in certain ways. How do you help that person find the thing that they click with? And that doesn't have to be a job. It could be a way of thinking, etc. So that's sort of how I think about it. And by the way, when I think about talent at my company and in companies in general, employees, it's sort of with that framing. It's like, how do we design a context and a role where this person can be the best version of themselves? Because if you have that, then you're getting the best out of that person. And when you put it together with other people who are, sort of at their peak state, you end up with a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. So that's sort of my philosophy on that.
Yeah. So for the listeners that have enjoyed this portion of the philosophy, is that I actually found it very valuable because in the last few minutes, you basically kind of helped us to understand your thinking process and the way you view the world. And in some kind of a parallelism, that philosophy is also carried to your work, in particularly Universe. Is that when we think about web or mobile experiences, there's a kind of a certain conventional approach. We start with a technology stack. We do development. We have a set of libraries that we use, and it's engineering centric. Here, you're taking a very different approach, and you are a proponent for no code. So tell us a little bit more about your startup.
Yeah, definitely. So my company is called Universe. We make an app that allows anybody to build a website from their phone. We are the first website builder designed from the ground up for mobile devices. But more than that, the way that you're building on Universe is different than any other context. Instead of filling out a template or writing code, you're playing with building blocks on Universe. So the way to think about it is almost like internet Legos. What's the difference between internet Legos and something like Wix or Squarespace, where you're dealing with a template? Well, one way of thinking about it is like this. If you're in a toy store and you want to buy a toy, and you want to buy the Millennium Falcon toy from Star Wars, right? You can buy the Lego set where you get a set of instructions and you can build the Millennium Falcon, or you could just go buy the pre-made toy, right? We're like the Lego set because we give you some guidance for how to build the thing you want to build. But when you're done playing with it, you can throw it against the wall. It breaks up into a million different pieces and you can build anything else. Now, if you bought that Millennium Falcon and you want to change, the style of the door or whatever, and you bought the pre-made version, you can't do that because the chassis won't bear it, right? So to speak. So the way of thinking about what we're building is almost like a new language for building on the internet. Now, why did I do that? Why did I start that? Well, I'm personally not a programmer. I can write code, but it's not how I prefer to think. I don't think well in that context. And I realized that actually most people don't think well in code. It's a very particular type of thinking that is highly abstract. It's highly indirect. You're working on a wall of text that's spitting out not just a visual thing, but a functional thing. And that's just a very sort of indirect connection between the form in which you're thinking and expressing yourself and the form in which it manifests, namely a website or an app or whatever. And so for as long as I could remember, back since I was 10, I felt like there wasn't a tool that was designed for me. Now, there had always been tools like Wix, like Dreamweaver, that were templatized where you could build a website, but it wasn't composable. What I mean by that is you couldn't make something with the tool that the creators of the tool hadn't anticipated. You were sort of just filling in the details. You're filling in the boxes, you were customizing the font, but you weren't actually designing. You weren't actually architecting and making your own thing. And I believe that there should be a product that allowed someone who, had sensibilities, they wanted to build on the internet, but they didn't want to do it with code. So that was sort of the initial inspiration. Became an obsession. When mobile devices came around, I realized that this was the perfect platform in which to express this idea because of two reasons. One is that everyone in the world has a phone. And these phones are not phones, they're computers. They're incredibly powerful computers. And the hardware limitation of these devices is no longer there, right? Like we've got super fast networks now, they're large screens, they're very tactile, etc. And the processors are really fast. The limitation is the software design. And that's an area where I can help. So I can design something that sort of unlocks a new sort of capability with that device. The second reason why mobile is important is because the way that you interact with a phone is by touching it. It's much more direct. When you're interacting with a desktop computer, you're manipulating with what's on the screen indirectly. You're doing it with a keyboard and a mouse. And that's just a much less sort of tactile and natural way of interfacing with something. We're humans. We have evolved to use our hands to sort of interact with things physically. And the way I look at it is that when you design good software for a phone, it can feel like a musical instrument. And it can allow you to get into a flow state that normally you'd need to be sort of playing and making music to do. And so that was sort of the inspiration. And about 2 years ago, we launched our product, which takes this new kind of interface. It's built on a grid system that has building blocks on top of it and allows you to build any kind of website, whether it's a store or a portfolio or just a page for your brand or a personal resume. You can get started with it for free, and you can upgrade to our pro product to get some more of the commercial functionality.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you're going beyond a visual editor. These are not templates, but rather it's like a line of code that is manifested in the form of a visual component, or what you call building blocks in a grid form. So you can in fact take the kind of micro component and then build it and then essentially configure it without necessarily having to even change some of the attributes or the meta aspects of it. So it's intriguing. What would you say is the closest programming language to something like this?
That's a good point. I don't think there is actually a similar. Okay, so that's an interesting question. We describe ourselves as almost like a visual language for building the internet, like a programming language. I would describe the closest thing to what we do as not a programming language in the classic sense, but to something like a design tool like Sketch. So Sketch is an application for the Mac that allows you to design similar to Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop. And you can draw UI and stuff with it. And the problem with Sketch is you design something, but then you have to build it, right? It doesn't live on the internet. It's not interactive, etc. Whereas when you design something with the universe, it works. There's no development. You already developed it. So you're designing it as you're building it. But I think that those kinds of design tools are a lot more like what we are. We're almost like a hybrid because I don't know of any sort of programming language that is visual in this way. There are visual programming languages, like there's Sketch, which is, sorry, not Sketch, there's Scratch, which is
Scratch, yeah.
which MIT developed, and it was originally developed for kids, and it's sort of a graphical interface for logic and for the basics of programming. But you're not building. I guess you can build an entire program on Scratch that doesn't display anything. Like it could just be a logical process. Whereas in our case, you're building the part of the thing that you interact with, right? So it starts with almost like the facade of your creation as opposed to the plumbing of the creation. And where most programming languages actually start with the plumbing and then give you the facade. So our product is almost more like, I get a lot of inspiration from cities and urban planning. And, the way I see it is that the internet's like the biggest city on earth. It's this sort of mega city. And the people who can build in that city right now are very limited. They're very limited people who can build. And so the buildings that they create are limited stylistically. They're pretty homogeneous. But if you made the building blocks in that city more accessible, you'd end up with more creative and diverse structures because people are able to configure that matter in new ways. And that's how I look at a city like New York, where you have a pizza maker who opens a shop, but then you also have a super high-end fashion designer, and then you have a lawyer, and they're opening up their own sort of storefronts that represent them. And you actually can't do that in the same way on the internet yet. And so I see a vibrancy that's possible online that we just don't have yet, that sort of has a much more diverse ecosystem.
So let's shift the conversation to a little bit more forward thinking in terms of what we define as the internet. So when we think about mixed reality, and particularly virtual reality, it's all about content, and so much of the effort and energy is creating these 3D modeling and create that immersive experience. So that's one. The other is that, of course, Apple and others have come up with watches, but really many believe, including Apple, there's been concrete information that's coming out that Apple is in fact planning to develop and launch glasses, which is an AR-focused set of glasses. They themselves believe that it's just a matter of time that the feature set will evolve so that glasses or glass form of wearable will eventually replace the iPhone. So in the case of VR, in the case of AR, how do you foresee this design approach and this way of creating, like I said, metaphorically, a sim city type of a model?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think about it a lot. So a couple things. First of all, I am extremely bullish on 3D computing in all of its varieties, whether it's AR, mixed reality, VR. That will happen. It is the future. We live in 3 dimensions, and computers will absorb that. With that said, even in the 3-dimensional world, there is a role for 2-dimensional things. In other words, we read books, they're physically 3-dimensional, but if you open the book, the page is 2-dimensional. And that is a very efficient format for consuming information. It's evolved over hundreds, thousands of years, right? Printed word. So I don't see a world where we don't have anything that's 2-dimensional. And I actually think the phone form factor will be around for a long time, as will the desktop form factor. But I think we're going to have more form factors. So we already have the watch, we're going to have glasses, but I think that these things will work in conjunction with each other. So let's assume, though, that we live in a world where you can sort of overlay software in 3 dimensions. The same philosophy that we've used for Universe on the phone will apply to that context, and we will enthusiastically embrace and push it forward. So just like you can build on our grid on the phone, that's in 2 dimensions, you can imagine building in a 3-dimensional grid, in AR or VR. And so we will definitely do that, and it's going to add a lot more color. But the interesting thing is, imagine a fluid experience that actually can carry through these different environments. So what does a website look like on a phone? What does it look like on a watch? What does it look like in 3D space? What does it look like on a television? Like, all of these modalities will exist, and you as a business or an individual are going to want to be representing yourself, your endeavor in that context. So, for us, we want to help define what that means, but also we want to make sure that the web has a place in these environments, because the web is not owned by anybody. The web is a free and open space. And in a world that's dominated by companies like Apple, Google, Facebook, it's really important to have this neutral space that isn't owned by anyone else. It allows for free ideas and competition and new entrants. And so when we think about our mission, it's very much entwined with that sort of openness of the web. And we want to make sure that even as these platforms are developed by some of these bigger companies, there is a place for the web, because that's the sort of engine of ingenuity. The web is the greatest thing I think humans have ever built as a collective. The only things that I think would rival it are like language or money, but it's on that scale. And so I think we need that in this future. I also think that this is going to happen more incrementally than people think. I don't think you're going to have one day a pair of smart glasses that comes out and just we get rid of our phones. I think that slowly, we're going to get these glasses. They're going to be useful for certain things like, getting directions or gaming or, there was one other, I was thinking about this earlier today, but you'll have these certain applications for glasses that you'll put them on occasionally. You're not going to always wear them. And slowly but surely, the camera is the other thing. Great for camera. The glasses form factor is like a great form factor for taking pictures. But it's not going to, for the glasses to really work, they can't need to do all the things that your phone does. That's the genius of like new platforms. If you launch a new platform with a very limited set of responsibilities that doesn't have to take over from the previous thing, then it is free to evolve into its own platform. So for example, when the iPhone first came out, it wasn't called an iComputer, it was called an iPhone, meaning it was a phone. It was positioned as a phone. So people were looking at it as a phone, not as a computer. It didn't have copy and paste when it first launched, right? Like you couldn't install apps from other third-party developers. It didn't matter in the long run. But now we have those things, and the iPhone has been able to evolve as its own sort of entity because it never had to replace the map. It never had to do, it never promised to say, okay, you're gonna use this phone, you're never gonna have to use your map. Turns out in the fullness of time, 80% of traffic on the web is coming from phones and not desktops anymore, but that didn't happen overnight. It happened, as an amalgamation. So I think the same thing will happen with these emerging platforms.
Yep, I couldn't agree with you more. We only have 1 minute left. We always ask, what was your greatest product innovation failure and what was a lesson learned?
I have a good one. Before Universe was a website builder, we had the same grid technology, but you weren't creating a website. You were creating what we called a verse, which was this sort of new creation, and that verse didn't live on the web. So you had to install the Universe app to see what anybody made. So we were trying to reinvent everything. The way that, the web page itself was our own format. The way that you create it was our own format. And then the place that you see it was our own place. It was completely walled off from the rest of the world. And it totally flopped. And when we pivoted towards building websites, it worked. And so the big learning there is when you're bringing something new into the world, you need to package it in a way that meets the world where it is. So there was this designer, his name was Richard Lowy. He was a mid-century industrial designer, and he had a principle. And his principle was MAYA, most advanced yet accessible. So it was very, very simple. If he was working on something that was really, really new and futuristic and high tech, he would try and design it so that it appeared to be very familiar. But if he was working on something that was super familiar, like cereal, he would make it seem like it was super foreign and futuristic. So you'd have like space age cereal and like accessible flying cars. So that's sort of a way of thinking about it. And for us, it's like we took this grid system, which is really new and novel, but it's a website builder and people already know what that means.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you for sharing that. So today I've been joined by Joseph Cohen, CEO of Universe. Joe, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks for joining.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.